The 28th of June, 1934, marked a night when Germany's streets ran crimson with the blood of its own Revolutionary Guard. Heinrich Himmler stood in his Munich office, telephone receiver pressed against his ear, listening to reports of executions carried out across the Reich. The night of the long knives had begun, and with it, the transformation of Germany's security apparatus into something the world had never witnessed before. Few understood then what was truly being constructed in the heart of Europe. The casual observer saw soldiers, policemen, and party officials. They did not see the intricate web of competing agencies, each vying for power, each building its own empire of surveillance and terror. The machinery being assembled would eventually encompass millions of Germans and extend its reach across an entire continent. Ernst Röhm, leader of the Sturmabteilung, had believed his brown-shirted stormtroopers were the future of German military power. His 4 million men had brought Adolf Hitler to power through street violence and political intimidation. But Röhm failed to recognize that Hitler needed something different now. The Führer required order, not chaos. He needed an army that answered to the state, not a revolutionary militia that might challenge his absolute authority. According to historical documentation from the German Federal Archives, the purge eliminated not merely Röhm and his immediate circle, but reshaped the entire security landscape of Nazi Germany. The SS, Himmler's Schutzstaffel, emerged from the bloodletting as the ascendant force. What had been Hitler's personal bodyguard unit transformed overnight into the primary instrument of state terror. The Geheime Staatspolizei, or Gestapo, had officially been established the previous year, in April 1933, under Hermann Göring's authority in Prussia. But its true power remained unrealized until Himmler wrested control from Göring in April 1934. The secret state police would become synonymous with Nazi terror, yet its actual structure remained remarkably small compared to its reputation. At its height, the Gestapo employed only about 32,000 agents to monitor a population of 80 million Germans. How did such a small force maintain such comprehensive control? The answer lay not in numbers but in psychology. The Gestapo cultivated an image of omnipresence, of knowing everything, of having informants everywhere. Every German lived with the possibility that their neighbor, their colleague, even their family member might report an unguarded word to the authorities. This atmosphere of mutual suspicion became the Gestapo's most effective weapon. Reinhard Heydrich, Himmler's deputy and head of the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst intelligence service, understood this principle perfectly. The blonde, cold-eyed former naval officer had been dismissed from the Kriegsmarine for dishonorable conduct, but found his true calling in the shadows of the Nazi state. Heydrich built his SD into a comprehensive intelligence network that infiltrated every aspect of German society, from universities to churches, from business associations to sports clubs. The security apparatus existed in a constant state of organizational chaos, with overlapping jurisdictions and competing power centers. The Wehrmacht had its own intelligence service, the Abwehr. The Foreign Ministry maintained its own information networks. The Nazi Party had its own security systems separate from the state apparatus. This Byzantine complexity was not a flaw, but a feature of Hitler's leadership style, keeping potential rivals divided while he retained ultimate authority. The 1st of September, 1939, brought the invasion of Poland and with it, an unprecedented expansion of Germany's security apparatus beyond its borders. As Wehrmacht tanks rolled eastward, following closely behind came the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that would demonstrate the true nature of the Nazi security system. These were not military formations in any traditional sense. They were executioners wearing military uniforms, bureaucrats of genocide equipped with rifles and transport vehicles. The Einsatzgruppen had been tested during the annexation of Austria in March 1938, and again during the occupation of Czechoslovakia. But Poland represented something qualitatively different. Here, the security forces would implement systematic policies of terror against entire populations, not merely individual political opponents. The distinction between security operations and mass murder dissolved entirely. Otto Ohlendorf, who would later command Einsatzgruppe D, was an economist by training, holding a doctorate in jurisprudence. He embodied the peculiar character of Nazi Germany's security apparatus, which combined educated professionals with sadistic street fighters, creating an organization capable of industrializing murder while maintaining meticulous records. The Einsatzgruppen commanders were not psychopaths selected for their bloodthirstiness. They were lawyers, professors, and civil servants who accepted mass killing as administrative policy. Behind the front lines, the occupation regime established itself with practiced efficiency. Hans Frank became Governor-General of occupied Poland, ruling from Wawel Castle in Krakow. Frank, another lawyer turned administrator of terror, oversaw the transformation of Poland into what he called a gigantic labor camp. The general government, as the occupied territory was designated, became a laboratory for the security state's most radical experiments. The Ordnungspolizei, the order police, played a role few history books adequately acknowledge. These were not elite SS men, but regular uniformed policemen, many of them middle-aged family men from ordinary backgrounds. Christopher Browning's research, documented in Studies of Reserve Police Battalion 101, revealed how these average men participated in mass shootings of Jewish civilians. The security apparatus did not require monsters. It transformed ordinary Germans into killers through incremental steps, peer pressure, and the authorization of authority. The system's effectiveness derived from its multi-layered structure. The Wehrmacht provided military security and conquered territory. The Einsatzgruppen conducted initial killing operations against targeted groups. The order police maintained routine control and participated in roundups and executions. The Gestapo investigated resistance and dissent. The SD gathered intelligence on occupied populations. The concentration camp system, administered by the SS Totenkopfverbände, the Death's Head units, provided a destination for those arrested. Each component reinforced the others, creating a comprehensive apparatus of control and extermination. Heinrich Himmler visited the Minsk ghetto in August 1941 and witnessed an execution personally. According to accounts from subordinates, he nearly fainted and became visibly ill. Yet this squeamishness did not produce any reconsideration of policy. Instead, Himmler ordered his subordinates to develop more humane methods of killing, which led directly to the development of gas vans and eventually to the construction of death camps. The security apparatus's response to the psychological difficulty of mass murder was not to stop killing, but to make it easier for the killers. The administrative machinery expanded constantly. Every occupied territory required its own structure of higher SS and police leaders, commanders of security police and SD, local Gestapo offices, and networks of informants and collaborators. The German occupation of Western Europe in spring 1940 added new territories to this empire of security. The Netherlands, Belgium, France, Denmark, and Norway each received their own overlapping bureaucracies of control, adapted to local conditions but following the same basic template. By the end of 1940, Germany's security forces had grown from a domestic apparatus of political repression into a continental system of occupation and genocide. The transformation had occurred with remarkable speed, suggesting that the capacity for this expansion had been built into the system from its inception. The 20th of January 1942 dawned cold and gray over the Berlin suburb of Wannsee, where 15 men gathered in a lakeside villa to coordinate the final solution. Reinhard Heydrich chaired the Wannsee Conference, bringing together representatives from every major government ministry and security agency. The meeting lasted merely 90 minutes, yet it formalized the transformation of Germany's security apparatus into an instrument of industrial genocide. The conference protocol, captured after the war and preserved in historical archives, reveals the bureaucratic language used to discuss mass murder. The participants spoke of evacuation, special treatment, and natural diminution, rather than killing, torture, and starvation. This linguistic camouflage allowed educated men to plan the deaths of 11 million people while maintaining the fiction that they were engaged in legitimate state security operations. Adolf Eichmann, who held the relatively modest rank of SS Obersturmbannführer, equivalent to lieutenant colonel, took minutes at the conference. Eichmann headed the Gestapo's Section 4B4, the Office for Jewish Affairs and Evacuation. From his Berlin desk, this meticulous bureaucrat would coordinate deportations from across occupied Europe, arranging train schedules, negotiating with railway officials, and ensuring the efficient transport of millions to their deaths. His case exemplified how the security apparatus distributed responsibility so widely that individuals could claim they were merely following orders or handling logistics. The death camps represented the ultimate expression of the security state's logic. Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Bełżec, Chełmno, and Majdanek were not military installations, but special facilities operated by the SS specifically for mass killing. Rudolf Höss, commandant of Auschwitz, approached his duties with the mentality of a factory manager optimizing production. He experimented with different configurations of gas chambers, tested various poisons to find the most efficient killing agent, and developed procedures for processing thousands of victims daily. The camps required extensive personnel. Guards, administrators, doctors, engineers, clerks, and laborers all participated in the machinery of death. The security apparatus recruited from various sources. Some were ideological volunteers, true believers in Nazi racial ideology. Others were ethnic Germans from occupied territories seeking employment and German citizenship. Some were concentration camp inmates themselves, given the terrible choice between collaboration and death. The Sonderkommandos, special squads of Jewish prisoners forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoria, represented the security system's ultimate perversion. By compelling victims to participate in the killing process, the SS implicated them in their own destruction and distributed psychological responsibility even to those being murdered. This demonstrated the totalitarian logic of the security apparatus pushed to its absolute extreme. Information about the camp's true purpose remained surprisingly controlled, despite the massive scale of operations. The SS used code words and euphemisms in all documentation. Camp personnel received strict orders about secrecy. Victims were deceived about their fate until the final moments. When rumors circulated among populations targeted for deportation, German authorities employed elaborate deceptions, including the construction of fake train stations and the distribution of postcards for deportees to send back, giving false reassurance. The security apparatus also had to manage the enormous quantity of property stolen from victims. The Wirtschafts- und Verwaltungshauptamt, the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office, created elaborate systems for sorting, cataloging, and distributing clothing, jewelry, currency, and other goods confiscated from those sent to the camps. Hair was collected for textile production, gold teeth were melted down for the Reichsbank, and personal effects were shipped to bombed-out German cities for distribution to air raid victims. The bureaucracy of theft operated with the same systematic efficiency as the bureaucracy of murder. Meanwhile, in occupied territories, the security forces faced increasing resistance. The Soviet partisan movement, Yugoslav partisans, French resistance, Polish Home Army, and numerous other groups challenged German control. The security apparatus responded with escalating terror. Collective punishment became standard policy. For every German killed, dozens or hundreds of civilians would be executed. Entire villages were destroyed in reprisal operations. These measures, intended to suppress resistance through fear, often produced the opposite effect by convincing populations they had nothing to lose through opposition. The 15th of May 1941 arrived with unexpected news that sent shockwaves through Germany's security establishment. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy and the third-ranking Nazi leader, had stolen a Messerschmitt fighter and flown solo to Scotland on what he claimed was a personal peace mission. The incident exposed the fundamental dysfunction within the security apparatus. The Gestapo, SD, Abwehr, and various other intelligence services had all failed to detect planning by one of the regime's most prominent figures. The Hess affair highlighted the intelligence war within the security system itself. Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr Military Intelligence Service, ran an organization that maintained complicated loyalties. Canaris himself harbored deep reservations about Hitler's regime, though the exact extent of his opposition remains debated by historians. Several of his subordinates, including Hans Oster, actively worked against the Nazi government while ostensibly serving it. The Abwehr became a haven for aristocratic military officers who viewed the Nazi movement with contempt, even as they provided intelligence services to its war effort. Heydrich and Himmler had long sought to neutralize the Abwehr and bring all intelligence functions under SS control. The competition between the SD and Abwehr created a secondary shadow war, with each service spying on the other, while both supposedly served the same government. Double agents, deception operations, and bureaucratic sabotage characterized this conflict. Information was hoarded rather than shared. Intelligence was manipulated to support predetermined conclusions or to discredit rival agencies. Walter Schellenberg, who headed foreign intelligence for the SD, represented the new generation of security professionals. Young, educated, and ambitious, Schellenberg built his career through bureaucratic skill rather than street-fighting credentials. He cultivated contacts across Europe, ran complex espionage networks, and presented himself as a sophisticated intelligence professional rather than a party thug. Yet Schellenberg remained complicit in all the regime's crimes, demonstrating how the security apparatus could attract talented individuals who might have served any government and channel their abilities toward monstrous ends. The Venlo incident of November 1939 demonstrated the security service's operational capabilities. SD agents, posing as German resistance members, lured two British intelligence officers to a meeting near the Dutch-German border, then kidnapped them at gunpoint. The operation, directed by Schellenberg, compromised British intelligence networks in Western Europe and provided propaganda value by supposedly exposing British interference in German internal affairs. It showed the security apparatus could execute sophisticated operations beyond simple terror and repression. The Red Orchestra, or Rote Kapelle as the Gestapo called it, represented one of the most successful Soviet intelligence networks operating in Nazi Germany. The network included German citizens, many from educated middle-class backgrounds, who passed information to Soviet intelligence throughout the war. When the Gestapo finally uncovered the network in 1942, the arrests revealed how, even within Hitler's Germany, opposition existed at various levels of society. The subsequent trials and executions, including the beheading of Harro Schulze-Boysen and Arvid Harnack, demonstrated the security apparatus's effectiveness once it identified targets, but also its initial blindness to threats within its own territory. Operation Bernhard exemplified the security service's criminal creativity. Beginning in 1942, the SS established a counterfeiting operation at Sachsenhausen concentration camp, forcing imprisoned experts to produce fake British pounds and American dollars. The operation, supervised by SS Sturmbannführer Bernhard Krüger, manufactured notes of such quality that they fooled experts. The plan was to destabilize enemy economies by flooding them with counterfeit currency, though the operation ultimately proved too limited in scale to achieve this goal. It did, however, provide the SS with foreign currency for intelligence operations. The security apparatus also engaged in extensive scientific intelligence gathering. German agents sought information about Allied weapons development, particularly rumors of atomic research. The Uranium Club, Germany's own nuclear program, received some support from intelligence services attempting to acquire materials and information from occupied territories. While the German atomic effort remained far behind the Allied Manhattan Project, the intelligence focus on nuclear matters showed the security service's understanding of strategic technological competition. By mid-war, the intelligence community had become a baroque edifice of competing fiefdoms. The Foreign Ministry maintained its own intelligence networks through embassies and consulates. The Waffen-SS developed its own intelligence capabilities, separate from the SD. Individual military commanders ran their own networks in their operational areas. The Nazi Party maintained informant systems through its own channels. This organizational chaos meant that Germany possessed enormous intelligence-gathering capacity, while often failing to analyze or act on the information collected, as different agencies refused to cooperate or even acknowledge each other's findings. The 18th of February 1943 brought Sophie Scholl, her brother Hans, and their friend Christoph Probst before the People's Court in Munich. Their crime was distributing leaflets calling for passive resistance against the Nazi regime. Their punishment was death by guillotine, carried out the same day. The White Rose Group's destruction illustrated how the security apparatus maintained control over the German home front through a combination of surveillance, denunciation, and swift, brutal punishment. The Gestapo's effectiveness on German soil relied less on its own agents than on ordinary Germans willing to denounce their neighbors, colleagues, and even family members. Research from the Gestapo's own archives, preserved after the war, reveals that the majority of investigations began with denunciations from private citizens rather than systematic surveillance. The security state depended on social atomization, breaking down bonds of trust and solidarity until every German felt isolated and potentially under observation. Block wardens, or Blockleiter, formed the Nazi Party's grassroots surveillance network. These local officials, responsible for neighborhoods of approximately 40 to 60 households, monitored residents' behavior, collected donations for party causes, distributed propaganda, and reported suspicious activities. Not all block wardens were zealous enforcers. Many performed their duties perfunctorily. But the system ensured that every German lived in proximity to an official representative of party authority. The Hitler Youth and League of German Girls indoctrinated young people while simultaneously creating networks of youthful informants. Children were encouraged to report politically suspect statements by their parents and teachers. While historians debate how frequently children actually denounced their own families, the possibility alone altered family dynamics. Private conversations became dangerous. Trust eroded even in the most intimate relationships. The security state penetrated into homes and hearts. After the defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943, the security apparatus faced growing challenges maintaining morale. Joseph Goebbels declared total war in a massive rally, calling for complete mobilization of German society. The security services intensified their monitoring of public opinion, compiling regular reports on popular mood and sentiment. These reports, remarkably candid in their assessment of declining morale, demonstrate that Nazi leaders understood their population's growing disillusionment, even as propaganda claimed unwavering support. The Kriminalpolizei, or Kripo, the criminal police, became increasingly integrated into the security apparatus. Initially focused on conventional crime, the Kripo found its mission expanded to include preventive crime fighting, which meant arresting individuals deemed socially undesirable even if they had committed no specific crime. This category included habitual criminals, the work-shy, homosexuals, Romani people, and anyone else the security state viewed as unworthy of belonging to the national community. Thousands were sent to concentration camps not for crimes committed, but for being considered inherently criminal. The special courts, or Sondergerichte, created a parallel justice system operating outside normal legal procedures. These courts handled political offenses, economic crimes, violations of wartime regulations, and anything else the regime defined as threatening state security. Defendants had limited rights, conviction rates exceeded 90%, and sentences were harsh. The death penalty was applied liberally for offenses that in normal times would merit minor punishment. A woman could be executed for complaining about food shortages if her complaint was deemed harmful to morale. Roland Freisler, president of the People's Court from August 1942 until his death in February 1945, personified the corrupted judiciary. A screaming, ranting judge who berated defendants and predetermined verdicts, Freisler condemned thousands to death in proceedings that mocked any notion of justice. The judiciary, once an independent pillar of German society, had been transformed into another instrument of the security state. Judges competed to demonstrate their ideological reliability through harsh sentences. The experience of Germans who lived through this period varied enormously. Those who conformed, who avoided politics, who joined appropriate organizations and displayed proper enthusiasm, could live relatively normal lives despite the dictatorship. For them, the security state remained largely invisible. They experienced the regime through propaganda victories, community celebrations, and social programs rather than through terror. This created a paradox where many Germans experienced Nazi rule as both oppressive and ordinary, allowing them to later claim they knew nothing of the regime's true nature. Others lived in constant fear. Jews remaining in Germany after emigration became impossible. political dissidents trying to survive through silence, clergy who could not reconcile conscience with compliance, workers who made unguarded comments, and anyone else who attracted the security apparatus's attention existed in daily terror of the knock on the door, the early morning arrest, the disappearance to places from which few returned. For these Germans, the security state was not abstract but an immediate crushing presence. The 9th of April 1943 marked the beginning of the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto, where SS Hauptsturmführer Amon Goeth oversaw operations with sadistic enthusiasm. Goeth, commandant of the nearby Płaszów labor camp, personally murdered prisoners from his villa balcony for entertainment. His behavior, while extreme, reflected the culture of impunity that characterized the security forces in occupied territories. Far from Berlin, with absolute power over subject populations, German security personnel could indulge any cruelty without consequence. The occupation regimes varied by territory, reflecting Nazi racial ideology. In Western Europe, the security apparatus generally maintained a veneer of correctness, at least initially. In Poland and the Soviet Union, all pretense of civilized conduct was abandoned. The Netherlands received a civilian occupation government under Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who maintained Dutch administrative structures while implementing Nazi policies. France was divided between occupied and unoccupied zones, with complex arrangements involving the Vichy government, until Germany occupied the entire country in November 1942. The security police and SD created networks of local collaborators in every occupied country. In France, the Milice, a paramilitary police force created in January 1943, zealously hunted resistance fighters and Jews, often proving more brutal than their German sponsors. In the Netherlands, the Dutch Nazi movement provided personnel for security operations. In Ukraine, local auxiliaries participated enthusiastically in anti-Jewish operations. The security apparatus understood that using local collaborators both conserved German manpower and implicated occupied populations in Nazi crimes, making resistance psychologically more difficult. The system of concentration and labor camps extended across occupied Europe. Natzweiler Struthof in Alsace, Gross Rosen in Silesia, Stutthof near Danzig, Ravensbrück for women, and dozens of smaller camps created an archipelago of terror. Each camp had its own administration, guard units, and industrial operations. Prisoners were worked to death in quarries, factories, and construction projects. The economic dimension of the camp system grew increasingly important as the war continued and German labor shortages intensified. The exploitation of forced labor became a massive operation, coordinated by the security apparatus. Fritz Sauckel, appointed plenipotentiary for labor deployment in March 1942, organized the deportation of millions of workers from occupied territories to Germany. The Gestapo enforced these deportations, hunting down those who attempted to evade labor service. By 1944, foreign forced laborers and prisoners of war constituted roughly 1/5 of the German workforce. The security services managed this population through a combination of police surveillance and terror, maintaining control despite enormous numerical disadvantages. The Bandenbekämpfung, or anti-partisan operations, consumed increasing security resources as resistance movements grew across occupied Europe. The security forces responded with escalating brutality. In Belarus, entire regions were depopulated through systematic killing and forced evacuation. Villages suspected of supporting partisans were burned with their inhabitants trapped inside. Erich von Dembach-Zelewski, appointed chief of anti-partisan units in October 1942, coordinated operations that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians under the pretext of security operations. According to documentation from the Nuremberg trials, the security forces routinely disregarded distinctions between combatants and civilians in anti-partisan operations. Any village in a partisan-controlled area could be designated a legitimate target. Any civilian could be shot as a suspected partisan supporter. The definition of partisan expanded to include anyone the security forces wished to eliminate. These operations combined military objectives with ideological goals, particularly the elimination of Jews who were automatically categorized as partisan supporters, regardless of any actual connection to resistance activities. The security apparatus also managed the puppet governments established in occupied territories. In Croatia, the Ustaše regime under Ante Pavelić conducted its own campaign of mass murder with German support. In Slovakia, the government of Josef Tiso collaborated in deporting its Jewish population. In Norway, Vidkun Quisling headed a collaborationist government so servile that his name became synonymous with treachery. German security advisors attached to these governments ensured their compliance with Nazi policies while maintaining the fiction of local autonomy. The destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto in spring 1943 demonstrated the security forces' military capabilities and ruthless determination. When Jews in the ghetto mounted armed resistance in April, the SS responded with artillery, fire, and systematic demolition of buildings. SS Brigade Führer Jürgen Stroop commanded the operation, producing a detailed report illustrated with photographs documenting the destruction. The report, recovered after the war, provided devastating evidence of both the uprising and its suppression, written from the perpetrator's perspective without any awareness that these records documented crimes rather than achievements. The 20th of July, 1944, exploded in a conference room at Hitler's East Prussian headquarters, where a bomb hidden in a briefcase detonated during a military meeting. The blast killed 4 men and wounded others, but Hitler survived with minor injuries. The assassination attempt, organized by Wehrmacht officers including Klaus von Stauffenberg, represented the most serious internal threat to Nazi rule. The security apparatus's response revealed both its effectiveness in crushing opposition and its previous blindness to conspiracy within the military elite. The failure of the July 20th plot triggered a wave of arrests, torture, and executions that continued for months. Approximately 5,000 people were arrested in connection with the conspiracy. Nearly 200 were executed, including Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, General Friedrich Ulbricht, and Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, who was shot the same night as the failed coup. Hitler ordered many conspirators hanged with piano wire from meat hooks, with their deaths filmed for his viewing. The security apparatus demonstrated its capacity for elaborate revenge. The Gestapo investigation, led by a commission of 400 officers, uncovered the conspiracy's extent. The plot involved not merely military officers, but also civilians from conservative elites, including Karl Friedrich Goerdeler, former mayor of Leipzig, and members of the Kreisau Circle, an intellectual resistance group. The investigation revealed that opposition to Hitler existed even among groups that had initially supported his regime. For the security apparatus, this discovery validated their paranoid worldview that enemies lurked everywhere. Earlier resistance efforts had met similar fates. The Oster conspiracy of 1939 through 1943 centered around Abwehr officers including Hans Oster and Hans von Dohnanyi, attempted to establish contacts with the Allies and warn them of German military plans. The conspiracy also helped Jews escape Germany, using Abwehr cover. When the Gestapo finally arrested the conspirators in April 1943, they initially charged them with currency violations and corruption rather than treason, suggesting the investigators had not fully grasped the conspiracy's scope. Only after July 20th did the Gestapo connect earlier investigations to the broader resistance network, leading to the execution of Canaris, Oster, and others in April 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender. The Solf Circle, an elite group of diplomats and intellectuals who met to discuss opposition to the regime, was betrayed by a Gestapo informant in September 1943. The subsequent arrests demonstrated how the security apparatus had infiltrated even the highest levels of German society. Members of the Solf Circle believed their social position provided protection, but the Gestapo recognized no immunity. Several members were executed, including the economist Helmuth James von Moltke, though others survived imprisonment to see the war's end. The Rotkapelle investigation, which began in 1942, had uncovered Soviet intelligence networks, but also revealed domestic opposition that operated independently of foreign control. The Gestapo's interrogations, which included extensive torture, produced information about resistance contacts but also false confessions and misleading information. The security apparatus's brutality undermined its investigative effectiveness. as desperate prisoners provided whatever information interrogators wanted to hear, rather than accurate intelligence. Herbert Wehner, who would later become a prominent West German politician, worked for Soviet intelligence and the communist underground in Germany before fleeing to Sweden in 1941. His survival, while many comrades perished, illustrated the arbitrary nature of the security state's reach. Geographic luck, timing, and chance often determined who lived and who died, rather than the security apparatus's systematic efficiency. The mythology of Gestapo omniscience obscured a reality of investigative limitations, bureaucratic dysfunction, and significant blind spots. The security forces also faced resistance from unexpected quarters. Some Catholic and Protestant clergy openly criticized regime policies from their pulpits, while most religious opposition focused on specific issues like the euthanasia program rather than comprehensive rejection of Nazi rule. Even limited criticism required courage when the security apparatus punished dissent ruthlessly. Bishop Clemens August Graf von Galen's sermons against euthanasia in August 1941 prompted the regime to temporarily suspend the program, demonstrating that public opposition could occasionally influence policy when the Gestapo feared broader unrest. The White Rose resistance group in Munich, centered on university students, had distributed anti-war leaflets until their arrest in February 1943. Their execution shocked many Germans precisely because they were young, idealistic, and came from respectable backgrounds. They represented not hardened conspirators but ordinary young people, driven by conscience to opposition. The security apparatus made no distinction, treating student protesters with the same brutality as armed resistance fighters. This approach eliminated specific threats while potentially inspiring others through the martyrdom of the executed. The aftermath of July 20th fundamentally transformed the security apparatus's relationship with the Wehrmacht. Military autonomy was effectively eliminated. SS and Gestapo influence over military affairs increased dramatically. The traditional salute was replaced by the Hitler salute in military settings. Political officers were assigned to military units. The security state penetrated more deeply into the last institution that had maintained some independence from direct Nazi control. The 27th of January, 1945, brought Soviet troops to the gates of Auschwitz, where they found approximately 7,000 surviving prisoners, the remnants of a vast killing apparatus. SS guards had already fled, forcing tens of thousands of prisoners on death marches westward in a desperate attempt to prevent their liberation. The camp's liberation exposed to the world the physical evidence of industrial genocide. Soviet photographers and journalists documented the mountains of personal belongings, the gas chambers, and the emaciated survivors. The security apparatus's greatest crime was finally being revealed. As Allied armies advanced from both east and west, the security forces faced the collapse of their empire. The reaction varied by agency and individual. Some SS units continued fighting fanatically, believing Nazi propaganda about Allied intentions or fearing retribution for their crimes. Others attempted to destroy evidence, burning documents, demolishing facilities, and killing remaining witnesses. Still others began preparing escape routes, establishing false identities, and securing funds for life after Germany's defeat. Heinrich Himmler, whose power had been second only to Hitler's, descended into fantasy. He believed he could negotiate with the Western Allies, offering to surrender to them while continuing to fight the Soviet Union. His secret contacts with Swedish Count Folke Bernadotte in April 1945 demonstrated complete detachment from reality. When Hitler learned of these negotiations, he stripped Himmler of all offices and ordered his arrest. The Reichsführer SS fled in disguise but was captured by British forces on the 23rd of May, 1945. He committed suicide by crushing a cyanide capsule before interrogation could begin. Adolf Eichmann fled from Prague as the war ended, eventually escaping to Argentina in 1950 using a false identity and the ratlines, escape networks established by various organizations, including sympathetic clergy and former SS officers. He lived under an assumed name until Israeli intelligence located him in 1960. His subsequent trial in Jerusalem in 1961 exposed the bureaucratic mechanisms of the final solution to global attention. Eichmann's defense that he was merely following orders and held no personal animosity toward his victims illustrated how the security apparatus had industrialized killing to the point where perpetrators could claim to be mere functionaries. Other security officials faced justice at the Nuremberg trials, which began with the International Military Tribunal in November 1945. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who had succeeded Heydrich as head of the RSHA, the Reich Security Main Office, after Heydrich's assassination in June 1942, stood trial as the highest-ranking security official captured alive. He was convicted and hanged in October 1946. The trials established the legal principle that following orders did not constitute a defense for crimes against humanity. Many security personnel, however, evaded justice entirely. The chaos of immediate post-war Europe allowed thousands to disappear into displaced persons camps, forge new identities, or flee overseas. Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor who conducted sadistic medical experiments, escaped to South America and was never captured despite decades of pursuit. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, who headed the Gestapo in that French city and was responsible for torture and deportations, also fled to South America with assistance from American intelligence, which employed him briefly as an anti-communist informant. Such cases revealed how Cold War priorities sometimes trumped justice for Nazi crimes. The classification of the security apparatus into criminal organizations by the Nuremberg Tribunal created legal complications that lasted for decades. The SS was declared criminal in its entirety, meaning membership alone could constitute guilt. The Gestapo and SD were similarly condemned. However, the Wehrmacht was not classified as a criminal organization, despite its extensive participation in war crimes, reflecting political considerations and the myth of the clean Wehrmacht that many German military officers promoted to Allied interrogators. Lower-level security personnel often received remarkably lenient treatment, particularly in Western occupation zones, where Cold War priorities emerged quickly. Many former Gestapo and SD officers found employment with West German police forces, intelligence services, and even with American and British intelligence operations targeting the Soviet Union. This continuity meant that some of the same individuals who had operated the Nazi security state were now employed by the democratic German state they had previously sought to destroy, creating lasting trauma for victims and moral complications that West Germany struggled to address for decades. The documentation left behind by the security apparatus proved both invaluable for historians and devastating for perpetrators who claimed ignorance. The Nazi regime's obsessive record-keeping meant that many crimes were meticulously documented by the perpetrators themselves. The Höfle telegram, discovered in archives, provided statistical evidence of deportations to death camps. The Jaeger report detailed massacres in Lithuania with numerical precision. The Einsatzgruppen reports documented mass killings across Eastern Europe with bureaucratic thoroughness. The perpetrators had created their own evidence, never imagining their defeat, or that these records would become the basis for war crimes prosecutions. The 18th of October, 1946, saw the execution of 10 convicted Nazi leaders at Nuremberg, their bodies cremated and ashes scattered in a river to prevent any grave from becoming a shrine. Among them was Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking security official to face the tribunal. The executions marked a symbolic closure to the initial phase of post-war justice, but the real reckoning with the security apparatus was only beginning as investigators. The subsequent Nuremberg trials, conducted by American military tribunals from December 1946 through April 1949, focused specifically on different aspects of Nazi criminality. The Einsatzgruppen trial, officially the United States versus Otto Ohlendorf et al., prosecuted 24 commanders of the mobile killing units. The evidence presented included the unit's own reports documenting the murder of more than 1 million people. 14 defendants received death sentences, though only 4 were actually executed due to sentence commutations influenced by Cold War politics and the desire to establish West Germany as an anti-communist ally. The Pohl trial examined the concentration camp system's administration. Oswald Pohl, who headed the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office, was convicted and hanged in 1951. The trial revealed the camp's dual function as instruments of terror and sources of slave labor for SS economic enterprises. Documents showed how the security apparatus had calculated the economic value of prisoners, including projected work output minus maintenance costs, plus the value of property confiscated and materials recovered from corpses. The industrial logic applied to mass murder shocked even hardened prosecutors. West Germany established its own processes for confronting Nazi crimes. The Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes was founded in Ludwigsburg in December 1958, prompted by investigations that revealed how many perpetrators lived undisturbed in German society. The office coordinated investigations across German jurisdictions, compiling evidence and preparing cases for prosecution. Its work led to numerous trials in the 1960s, including the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials from 1963 to 1965, which prosecuted 22 defendants for crimes committed at the camp. East Germany took a different approach, emphasizing communist resistance to fascism while downplaying specific crimes against Jews. The German Democratic Republic prosecuted some Nazi criminals, but also used allegations of Nazi connections as a political weapon against West Germany, claiming the Federal Republic had not adequately confronted its past. The division of Germany created two competing narratives about the Nazi era and responsibility for its crimes, with the security apparatus's legacy contested between different political systems. The Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961 became a watershed moment in public consciousness about the Holocaust. Israeli prosecutors presented extensive testimony from survivors, making the human reality of genocide visceral and immediate for a global audience. Eichmann's defense, articulated by political philosopher Hannah Arendt as the banality of evil in her controversial reporting, sparked debates about the nature of bureaucratic perpetration that continue today. The trial demonstrated how the security apparatus had enabled ordinary individuals to participate in extraordinary crimes through organizational structures that diffused responsibility. Fritz Bauer, the German prosecutor who worked with Israeli intelligence to locate Eichmann, exemplified post-war justice advocates who faced resistance from within German institutions. Many of Bauer's colleagues had served under the Nazi regime and showed little enthusiasm for investigating their former colleagues or superiors. Bauer's determination to pursue Nazi criminals, despite institutional obstruction, helped shift German public opinion, particularly among younger generations who began questioning what their parents and grandparents had done during the war. The trial of concentration camp guards continued for decades. In 1979, West Germany eliminated the statute of limitations for murder, ensuring Nazi criminals could be prosecuted regardless of how much time had passed. This led to trials in the 21st century of individuals who had been guards or low-level functionaries, often now elderly and claiming they were merely following orders or had no choice. These late trials sparked debates about justice delayed, whether elderly defendants could receive fair trials, and whether prosecutions served more symbolic than practical purposes. The search for Joseph Mengele continued until his death was confirmed in 1985, when forensic examination of remains exhumed in Brazil proved he had drowned in 1979. The decades-long hunt demonstrated both the commitment to pursuing Nazi criminals and the limitations of post-war justice. Many perpetrators lived out their lives in freedom, protected by sympathetic networks, the Cold War's political calculations, or simply the difficulty of locating individuals who had disappeared into post-war chaos. The question of collective responsibility versus individual guilt remained contentious. Did serving in the security apparatus automatically constitute criminal guilt, or must individual crimes be proven? The Nuremberg classification of organizations as criminal suggested the former, but practical legal proceedings generally required proof of specific criminal acts. This created situations where individuals who had participated in the machinery of genocide could avoid conviction if their specific role could not be definitively documented, while the documentary evidence showed they had been part of institutions whose sole purpose was criminal. The 9th of November 1989 brought the fall of the Berlin Wall, symbolically ending the division of Germany that had partly resulted from the Second World War. As Germany reunified, questions about the security apparatus's legacy took on new dimensions. Files from the Stasi, East Germany's secret police, were opened to public examination, prompting comparisons between Nazi and communist security states. Both had maintained comprehensive surveillance, used informants to atomize society, and justified repression as necessary for security. The comparisons highlighted how security apparatus can threaten the societies they claim to protect. The institutional memory of Nazi crimes has been preserved through numerous mechanisms. The German Federal Archives maintain extensive records from the Nazi period, including many documents produced by the security apparatus. The Institute for Contemporary History in Munich conducts ongoing research. Memorial sites at former concentration camps serve both as museums and as places of remembrance. These institutions ensure that the historical record remains accessible, countering denial and distortion. Holocaust education has become mandatory in German schools, part of a broader Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the process of coming to terms with the past. Students study not merely the fact that genocide occurred, but the mechanisms that enabled it, including the role of the security apparatus. This education aims to develop critical thinking about authority, obedience, and individual moral responsibility. The pedagogical approach recognizes that understanding how ordinary people participated in extraordinary crimes is essential to preventing future atrocities. The legal legacy extends beyond specific prosecutions. The Nuremberg Principles became foundational for international criminal law. The concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide, though not invented at Nuremberg, gained legal definition there. The establishment of the International Criminal Court in 2002 represented the culmination of efforts to create permanent mechanisms for prosecuting mass atrocities. The security apparatus's crimes helped establish that certain actions transcend national sovereignty and constitute offenses against humanity itself. Psychological research has examined how the security apparatus functioned. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, though methodologically controversial, were explicitly designed to understand how ordinary Germans could participate in genocide. The research suggested that situational factors and authority structures powerfully influence behavior, meaning that under certain conditions, many people will commit harmful acts they would otherwise find abhorrent. This finding has implications for understanding not just Nazi crimes but human behavior in institutional contexts generally. The question of how societies prevent the emergence of similar security apparatuses remains relevant. Democratic institutions, civil liberties, independent judiciary, free press, and robust civil society all serve as barriers against totalitarianism. Germany's post-war constitution, the Basic Law, included explicit protections against the abuse of power that had characterized Nazi rule. The Federal Constitutional Court gained authority to ban anti-democratic parties. Human rights became constitutionally protected. These mechanisms reflect lessons learned from the security state's atrocities. Contemporary security debates often reference Nazi-era precedents as cautionary examples. Discussions about surveillance technology, data collection, preventive detention, and emergency powers invoke the history of how security apparatus can expand beyond control. The Nazi security state began with measures against specific threats that gradually encompassed entire populations. This historical trajectory informs current debates about balancing security and liberty, reminding us that powers granted for particular purposes can be expanded to serve broader agendas. The personal legacy for survivors and their descendants continues to shape memory and identity. For Jewish survivors particularly, the destruction of European Jewish life by the security apparatus represented not merely individual trauma, but collective catastrophe. The establishment of Israel was partly a response to the Holocaust, reflecting the conclusion that Jews required their own state for protection. The memory of the security apparatus's crimes thus shaped geopolitical developments that continue to influence international relations. For Germans, particularly younger generations, the security apparatus's legacy presents questions about collective identity and historical responsibility. How should contemporary Germans relate to crimes committed by previous generations? German public discourse has generally emphasized responsibility, to remember rather than inherited guilt. distinguishing between acknowledging historical crimes and claiming personal culpability for acts committed before one's birth. This balance remains contested, particularly in debates about immigration, nationalism, and European integration. The academic study of Nazi Germany's security apparatus continues to yield new insights as archives open and methodological approaches evolve. Historians have moved from examining institutional structures to studying everyday experiences, from analyzing elite decision-making to understanding how ordinary people navigated life under totalitarianism. Recent scholarship has particularly focused on the participation of professional classes, including lawyers, doctors, and academics, in the security state, revealing how institutional legitimacy was constructed through elite cooperation. The ultimate lesson from Germany's wartime security forces may be that protecting freedom requires eternal vigilance against those who would sacrifice liberty for security. The Nazi security apparatus justified every expansion of power as necessary for protecting the German people. It claimed to defend the nation while actually destroying it morally and eventually physically. Understanding this history remains essential, not as an exercise in condemnation, but as a guide for recognizing warning signs when security institutions begin to threaten, rather than protect, the societies they serve. The memory of what was done by those wearing uniforms and claiming to ensure safety stands as a permanent reminder that the greatest threats to civilization can come from its own institutions when they escape accountability and operate without moral constraints.